Your book is A Perfect Mess, The Hidden Benefits of Disorder. It was published by Little Brown. How and why did you come to co-author a book on the notion that mess and disorder might be harmless, even beneficial?
Well, it happened in a way that is still surprising to me to think about it. It's certainly not the way everyone tends to assume. People think, oh, you must be a real messy guy, and you look for some way to justify that. No, 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 no. I actually am kind of a messy guy, but never occurred to me to try to justify it. Actually, I ran into a physicist who was studying the ways that counterintuitively adding a certain amount of randomness to certain kind of physical systems like an electronic circuit can actually make it work better. You'd think if you add noise or static to a circuit, it stops working. In fact, in some cases, the opposite is true. And it turns out that anywhere you look in nature, you can find examples of this. And this became an exploding scientific field in the 1990s. And that's what I became interested in. And it turns out one of the places you look for disorder and find it is the human brain. And study after study have shown, experiments have shown, that if you take some of the noisy signaling out of the brain, it doesn't work as well. We thrive on disorder in the brain. And I thought to myself in working on this book, well, if this is true everywhere you look in nature and in the human brain, could it possibly be true in daily life? Could it be true in organizations, in politics? And I started to investigate, and the more I looked into it, the more I realized, yeah, it is true.
In fact, in the book, you take sort of a representative tour of a messy home and a disorganized school and disorganized businesses. Tell us a little bit about how you set out to kind of prove that there are benefits.
I got to tell you, honestly, it was all random. It was entirely disordered. Now, I mean, three of my favorite examples in the book, I talk about a school, I talk about a bookstore, and I talk about a hardware store that are very, very messy and incredibly successful. They're all within a mile of my house. It's really, I thought I was going to travel around the world tracking down all these exotic examples of mess if I looked hard enough. It was just the opposite everywhere I looked. It's really kind of a consciousness-raising thing. Once you get it, and I certainly didn't at first, but once you get it, you see it everywhere.
Well, speaking of consciousness raising, today we're bombarded with ways to become more organized. There are even, there's an enormous and growing network of national professional organizers who are selling their services and their wares. And when you talked with people, you surveyed more than 260 people. When you asked them about messes, they felt guilty or ashamed that they had a messy workspace or a messy car or home.
Yeah, it was almost universal, and it was really shocking to me, the results of the survey. Yes, I mean, people tend to be messy, and they feel really, truly horrible about it. And yeah, there's a big industry that has sprung up to address this need of people feeling terrible about being real messy, and they've created this role model of the pristine home, the immaculate office, that we see wherever we look. And the message is drummed into our heads from kids anyway, and now we see it ever more strongly. The heroes of our society are the really well organized.
And you have found that those who have the highest educations, the highest salaries, and the most work experience tend to have the messiest desks.
Yes, it was actually an office temp company did a large survey of corporations and found that correlation. Now, I'm not really surprised at all. And the funny thing is, even though people are surprised to hear about this idea that mess is a good thing, 90% of the people, when you start talking to them about it, actually realized they knew that was true all along. They knew that in their mess, they knew where everything was. They knew that people who are really neat waste a lot of time straightening everything up. I think this is common sense.
Well, give us a concrete example of how disorganization or mess trumps real orderliness.
Sure. I think the one that people relate to the most easily is a messy desk. Most people have one, and most people feel bad about it. But the fact of the matter is, if you have a really neat desk, what it means is you're doing is every time a new piece of paper comes on your desk, you got to do something with it. Maybe you get up and walk to a filing cabinet and file it away, and then 3 months later, by the way, forget where you filed it. Maybe you go, well, I don't like to keep any extra stuff. I think I won't need it, I'll throw it out. You purge all the time. Messy person lets things pile up naturally. Okay, they know where their important stuff is. It's near them. It's near the top of the pile. The stuff that's buried way in the back, well, you probably don't need it. And because it sort of fits the way you were thinking, you kind of remember where stuff is. The neat person, in trying to find things, remember things were, well, they threw them out. What did they file that bill under? Urgent? Acme? The bill file? I'm not sure I remember. it really makes perfect sense. They waste a lot of, neat people waste a lot of time and actually are less efficient in many ways.
And one way to avoid a mess is not to do much.
And in the end, I mean, actually it's a fundamental law of physics. It's called the second law of thermodynamics. You make a mess no matter what you do. And the more you do, the bigger a mess you make. And the only way to do something about that is spend a lot of time and energy getting rid of that mess. And I don't think that should be a high priority.
Now, you open the book, chapter 1 is with the following quote from Albert Einstein, who might be considered the godfather of the science of the useful mess. He says, if a cluttered desk is a sign of a cluttered mind, of what then is an empty desk? So how would you answer his rhetorical question? I guess that not much is happening.
Well, I certainly wouldn't say, as he's implying jokingly there, I really don't mean to get down on neat freaks. I really don't. I think it's important for me to point out that the point of the book is not to say that messier people are better in any way, that neater people don't do as well. The point is to say, let's not assume that neater is better. And don't assume that if you're a messy person, as you probably are, statistically speaking, that anything is wrong here. That's really the point. I want people to be more open-minded about it, feel less guilty about it, and be a little more relaxed, and in the end, probably more efficient.
Well, maybe it would help if you defined mess for us and then talked a little bit about how much disorder is the right amount.
Sure. Well, there are very technical ways and scientific ways to define mess, and they're really not very helpful. One of the nice things about mess is I've never really spoken to anyone who misunderstands what it is, I don't think. Everybody seems to have a very good intuitive idea of things being scattered around. What's interesting is to point out there are types of mess that people sometimes don't think about as mess. For example, there's mess in time. You're a person with a very neatly scheduled day is being neat in time, whereas a person who's improvising is being messy in time. So there are sort of dimensions of mess, and there are different arenas of mess. But you know, when you ask the question, well, what's the right amount of mess? One of the nice things about being messy is that no one has to tell you how to do it.
We all know how.
We do. It comes very, very naturally. I think there's a good reason for that. And as soon as I start telling people, here are the 5 steps for being messy, I think we've all lost. I think we've missed the point here. But I will say this. Here's a simple game to play. If you're wondering if you're too messy or not messy enough, do this. Try being a little messier. See what happens. Do things get better? Do things get worse? If they get worse, all right, try being a little neater. And I think intuitively, we all play this game anyway, but I say experiment with it, see what happens.
Well, that analogy you just gave sort of made me think of weight loss. We tend to bounce back to where we're comfortable.
Yep. Yes, and messy people, and there actually I found a researcher who actually studied this in the office. He found out that you can actually make people much neater than they normally are for a very short period of time. And virtually 100% of the time, they'll bounce back to exactly the same level of messiness. You know, once in a while, you do meet naturally messy people who have managed to straighten themselves up, but they're often, they feel like they're in a straitjacket. For the most part, we end up pretty much where we belong.
So it sounds like it's a losing battle to fight with your kids about cleaning up their rooms. And as you noted from talking with people all over the country, lots of relationships are soured because one partner is messy and the other one's a neatnik. It's
huge. It's the majority of couples list disagreements about levels of messiness causing a problem in their relationship. In our survey, it was a factor in 1 out of 12 divorces and separations. A significant factor was a disagreement in messiness. And I would say, look, I think we should be able to work this out. And one of the important things to point out is it's not just the job of the messy person to be neater, which is generally the assumption with couples, that there's the bad messy person and the good neat person. Really what we have here is a disagreement and we need a compromise. Now that's not rocket science. I mean, I think, hey, if nothing else, if I can convince 1% of couples to be a little bit more relaxed about this kind of disagreement, I think I've done a huge service to the world.
Well, you in fact say that there are 6 key, that messiness confers 6 key benefits, and one of them is flexibility. You mentioned just a moment ago, I think you said improvisational lifestyle or something, you used the word improv. And you talked about Arnold Schwarzenegger as being very successful and living this improvisational lifestyle where time is not real rigid to him things kind of happen.
Yeah, it's funny. He often is regarded by most of us as an incredibly ordered person, and there's
disciplined.
that very disciplined, and there's that great idea of Arnold Schwarzenegger saying as a young man to his friends when he was a kid, teenager, I'm going to become the champion of the world in bodybuilding. I'm going to conquer the bodybuilding world. Then I'm going to come to America and conquer the world there, and then I'm going to become a movie star,
and
then I'm going to become, yes, and eventually, and I'm going to marry a Kennedy. What an unbelievable, ridiculous myth. Let me tell you how Arnold Schwarzenegger came to America. A friend of his called him from the airport in Vienna and said, I'm going to America. And Arnold said, wait for me. And he showed up at the airport without a visa, in his sweat clothes with a gym bag. He's an extraordinarily improvisational person. He used to have no appointment calendar until he became governor. You couldn't make an appointment with Arnold Schwarzenegger.
So flexibility is important, and that's one of the things that are conferred by messiness. Invention, and you mentioned in your book the architect Frank Gehry, who created these just phenomenal designs that people basically had to throw away the books and figure out a new way to build things.
Frank Gehry was really interested in sort of getting people out of the comfortable rut they tend to get into when they're actually creating a design. And now certainly he did that in his own design process, but he thought the problem was once he turned over the design, as architects always do in greatly detailed spec form, blueprints, to the builders, that they would then rotely go ahead and build it. He wanted the invention to keep going throughout the building and the interior decoration and everything else. And the way he did it was he refused to give the builders blueprints.
Oh my gosh.
He gave them a model and he said, make it look like this. And they said, but how? And he said, figure it out. And in doing that, the builders invented new techniques, they improvised, they changed, and I think most people agree his buildings are really extraordinary and magnificently creative.
You've said, too, that even terrorists, Al-Qaeda, for example, benefits from a certain level of disorganization. While we are fighting them in a very organized fashion, they're fighting back in a more haphazard way.
Yeah, they sure are, and we undisputably have the most powerful, most effective military force this world has ever seen by a long shot, and look who's giving us all this trouble. I mean, it's kind of a ragtag group, and their messiness is really working in their favor. We can capture them. We can capture people in Al-Qaeda. What can we find out from them? Nothing. Doesn't matter what we do for them, torture or not, we're not going to find much out because they don't know. They're not organized. It springs up here, it disappears there, their tactics change weekly. We figure out how to stop this kind of device, they come up with a new one. It's really a tough situation, and one of the things our military has to do now, in fact our whole government and society, is learn how to think in messier ways that can be more effective in combating this kind of messy attack.
You have a chapter in your book called The History of Mess, and actually sort of the guru of all this is a guy by the name of Frederick Taylor, who wrote a book in 1914 that you talk about, The Principles of Scientific Method. And lots of people used his information. Ford Motor Company, for example.
Yes. Interestingly, Ford himself never credited Taylor. And so there's actually some disagreement about whether Ford really used Taylor or not, followed him at least in spirit. But Taylor changed the world. And not just the business world, by the way, interestingly enough. But Taylor came out with this idea that if you want to have an effective workforce, then you as an employer, as the smart guy in your company, have to tell your stupid workers exactly how to do things. Never trust a worker to figure out the best way to work. Watch the way the job is done, and then go in and say you will do step 1, you will do step 2, and you will do step 3, and you will do it this way every single time, and if you don't, you will make less money or I'll fire you. People love this idea. The world exploded in delight because what happened was companies tried it, and you know what? It always worked. Actually, productivity actually improved. And what happens was people started to raise their families this way. This is where cheaper by the dozen came from. A true story, by the way. This guy really raised his family by a stopwatch. He made them, while they were taking showers, they had to do their homework. They were only allowed to use so many strokes of a bar of soap. Everything they did in the family was studied this way. And we laugh at it now. But what would it have been like to be? And millions of Americans embraced this. Churches embraced it. The legal system embraced it. The studies were entirely discredited a couple of decades later. It turns out that when you introduce any management change and observe it, you'll always see an increase in productivity. Lower the lights, increase in productivity. Turn the lights up, increase in productivity. And so they realized Taylor was wrong about everything. And yet, that idea which spread so far in society, has never left us, and we still see it today.
Yeah, in fact, places like McDonald's and Ruby Tuesdays, they have a certain standardization. So whether you're in State College or you're in New York, McDonald's hamburger tastes the same because of that standardization. You talk in your book about a restaurateur in New York who throws all that out.
Yeah, in fact, I think most of us agree about this. Sure, there's something to be said for the fact that you can go to a McDonald's anywhere in the world. I've been to one in Paris and one in Tokyo. They serve wine in the Paris one. Yeah, you're going to get a certain experience you can count on it. In a Starbucks, there's something to be said for that, sure. But I think what most of us are really thrilled by is when you go and you see something that's really novel. Somebody's doing something in a really different kind of way that you weren't expected. And I think this is really true in the retail environment. And that's one reason that messy restaurants, messy stores sometimes really are incredibly successful and fun to shop in.
Now, another of the 6 benefits of messiness is what you call robustness or well-rounded strength. And you talk in the book about a school called the Little Red Wagon that had no curriculum.
That's right, yes. In fact, it is absolute school policy. You never have a lesson plan, not for that day, never mind for the week or the month or the term. And what the teachers do here is they give the students lots of things, little objects, found objects, strange objects. It might be twigs, it might be little building blocks, anything, and just sit with them and let's see what they do. And the teacher sort of follows the student's lead in terms of what they're interested in and builds a lesson plan on the fly with the students. And my favorite story from the school is the teacher who saw a student grab a doll and start smashing it on the table. And the rule here is, unless someone's hurting someone else, you don't tell a student not to do it. So she went over and said, how come you're doing that? And the student said, well, it turns out he was in the hospital, he had gone to the emergency room, and he wanted an injured patient to work on. Teacher said, okay, and another student came over. They ended up having a month-long section on medicine and the human body and hospitals, all based on students wanting to play in a certain way.
And these kids did well, according to the studies, when they went on to regular school.
All these kids tended to do at least as well and in general better on standardized tests, which of course has made so many curricula so incredibly rigid in many of our schools.
Now, one of the things in your book that I liked especially was something that you wrote about called the Noguchi filing system. It makes perfect sense to me. Explain what it is.
Yes. Well, the basic idea of the Noguchi filing system is you put everything in envelopes and stack them on their side, almost like an accordion.
Like a bookshelf.
Yeah, like a
with
bookshelf.
A
That's right. And you label what they are. And what happens is when you take something out, you put it at one end of the system. And the result is, over time, oversimplifying here a little bit, but basically the idea over time is the things that are most used end up migrating towards that side of the system, so you know where the things you're most likely to want are, and it becomes easy to retrieve them. And what I love pointing out about this is basically all this is a horizontal version of a messy pile on your desk. What happens is on your desk, the stuff that you're always taking and using, you put on the top of the pile, and that the useful stuff ends up on the top of piles, and the less useful stuff ends up buried.
Give us your do's and don'ts on multitasking, because we live in an era where the cell phone's ringing, your email tells you that there's a new message for you, and I don't know about you, but I'm often going back and forth. Some people check email once every 3 hours. Mine is on and alerts me every time there's a message. Is that a good idea, or are there smart ways to multitask?
Well, I think there probably are better ways to multitask, and I suspect it's very different for different people. I mean, what you're really talking about here is how the brain is structured, how our consciousness is structured, our work habits. This is such a complex and varied sort of subject that I think it would really be silly for anyone, as many people do, by the way, to try to tell people multitasking is bad, or here's how you should multitask. And what I say is, whatever you're doing is probably pretty good for you, chances are. I do want to point out, since driving often gets into the mix here, I do not advocate heavily multitasking while driving. A lot of people simply can't handle that, so watch out. But if human life is not at risk here, I'd say, hey, get interrupted, multitask, whatever works.
It's a must-read book. And not just for those of us who are messy. What's the feedback been so far?
Overwhelmingly positive. Some very sharp negative criticism from predictable quarters, a tremendous minority. It's just been really wonderful to hear people react to it.
All right. The book is A Perfect Mess by our guest today, David H. Freedman. The book is published by Little Brown. Thanks so much for talking with us.
Thanks. A pleasure.
A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.